when a critically wounded Navy SEAL was rushed into the emergency room. The entire dynamic of the night shift changed in an instant. The wounded operator's eyes swept across the crowded trauma bay, searching through the sea of doctors and nurses. Then he spotted Hannah Jefferson. Despite the blood loss, despite the pain, his expression sharpened. He raised a trembling hand and snapped a crisp military salute. Silence spread through the room. The staff stared in confusion. The quiet nurse they mocked every day had just been recognized by one of the nation's most elite warriors. And suddenly, everyone realized they knew almost nothing about Hannah Jefferson. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Seattle's Mercy General Hospital glowed beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Outside, the city slept beneath a blanket of rain. Inside the emergency department, the chaos never truly stopped. It simply slowed to a simmer. For 32-year-old Hannah Jefferson, every shift felt less like nursing and more like surviving a battlefield of a different kind. Officially, she was a registered nurse. Unofficially, she was the department's designated dumping ground. The person assigned every unpleasant task. The person everyone took advantage of. The person nobody respected. Hannah was quiet, meticulous, and unfailingly professional. She never gossiped, never complained, and never participated in the endless politics that dominated the nurse's station. Those qualities should have earned respect. Instead, they made her a target. Leading the charge was head nurse Brenda Higgins. After 20 years at Mercy General, Brenda ruled the floor through intimidation and favoritism. She surrounded herself with loud personalities who laughed at her jokes and repeated her opinions. Anyone who didn't fit into her circle quickly found themselves on her bad side. Hannah had never fit in. Jefferson. Brenda's voice sliced through the department. Hannah looked up from her charting. Yes, room 402 needs cleaning. The patient vomited all over the bed. After that, Dr. Alastair wants every 4 line on the West Wing checked and retaped. Hannah blinked. The assignment made no sense. Environmental services normally handled room cleanup, and the 4 lines had already been inspected earlier in the evening. The order wasn't necessary. It was punishment. Still, Hannah simply nodded. Understood. As she walked toward the supply room, laughter erupted behind her. Dr. Richard Alastair, a second-year resident with an inflated ego and an expensive watch, leaned against the counter holding an espresso cup. "I still don't know how she passed her boards," he said loudly. Several nurses chuckled. "Yesterday I asked for epinephrine during a code, and she actually paused to verify the dosage before handing it over." He shook his head dramatically. "Who does that in an emergency?" Brenda smirked. "Someone who's not cut out for emergency medicine." More laughter followed. "She's too slow," Brenda continued. "No instincts. No confidence. Give it 2 months, and she'll be working at some suburban clinic." Inside the supply room, Hannah closed the door. The noise faded. She placed both hands on a shelf and took a slow breath. For seconds in. Hold. For seconds out. Tactical breathing. The habit had never left her. Her pulse slowed instantly. Her hands remained perfectly steady. They always did. Beneath her scrubbed sleeve, a jagged scar wrapped around her left arm. Most people assumed it came from an accident. It hadn't. The scar came from shrapnel. Afghanistan. A lifetime ago. Nobody at Mercy General knew the truth. When Hannah applied for the position, she intentionally submitted a heavily redacted resume. It listed her nursing qualifications and civilian certifications, but omitted years of military service. She wanted anonymity. Nothing more. Before arriving in Seattle, Hannah had spent 3 deployments attached to Army trauma teams supporting special operations units in Afghanistan. She had worked inside surgical tents illuminated by red emergency lights. She had treated catastrophic injuries while mortar rounds exploded nearby. She had kept wounded operators alive during helicopter evacuations through active combat zones. Compared to that, Brenda Higgins was merely an annoyance. A loud one, but still an annoyance. So Hannah endured. She ignored the insults, ignored the gossip, ignored the attempts to undermine her. Unfortunately, Brenda interpreted silence as weakness. The bullying escalated. Vacation requests mysteriously disappeared. Schedules were altered without warning. Hannah received the most difficult patients and the least support. She worked double shifts while others left early. Still, she said nothing. Then came the sepsis patient. A middle-aged man in room 3 began deteriorating rapidly. His blood pressure dropped. His oxygen levels crashed. The room erupted into confusion. While Dr. Alistair fumbled through possibilities, Hannah immediately recognized the problem. Years of trauma medicine had trained her eyes to spot subtle changes before monitors sounded alarms. Without hesitation, she adjusted the treatment according to standing protocols and alerted the physician. The intervention stabilized the patient. The man's condition improved within minutes. Later that evening, Alistair proudly accepted praise from attending physicians. Hannah's contribution was never mentioned. Instead, she was summoned to Brenda's office. The head nurse shut the door. "You acted outside your role." Hannah remained silent. "You are a nurse, not a doctor." Brenda's hand slammed onto the desk. "You do not make decisions. You do not improvise. You follow instructions." The room grew quiet. "You are at the bottom of the food chain here, Jefferson." Brenda leaned forward. "Remember your place." For several seconds, Hannah simply looked at her. Her face remained expressionless. Her eyes, however, were different. Cold. Still. Like stone. The same eyes that had once watched helicopters descend through desert dust. The same eyes that had seen things nobody in this hospital could imagine. Finally, she nodded. "Understood." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Brenda dismissed her with a wave. Hannah turned and walked away. But somewhere beyond the walls of Mercy General, fate was already moving. A storm was coming. And before the night was over, the quiet nurse everyone treated like a doormat would be forced to reveal exactly who she had once been. The emergency department was about to learn a lesson none of them would ever forget.
It happened on a Tuesday night. Rain hammered against the glass doors of Seattle's Mercy General in relentless waves, turning the parking lot into a shimmering blur of reflected lights. Inside the emergency department, the shift had settled into a frustrating lull. For Dr. Richard Alistair and head nurse Brenda Higgins, boredom usually meant finding new ways to make Hannah Jefferson miserable. For the third time that week, Hannah had been ordered to reorganize the crash carts from top to bottom. She was quietly sorting medication trays when the red phone rang. Every head in the department turned. The red phone wasn't used for routine emergencies. It was the direct line to county emergency dispatch, reserved for disasters, mass casualty incidents, and critical high-profile traumas. Brenda grabbed the receiver. As she listened, the color drained from her face. "What?" The room fell silent. "How far out?" A pause. "Blast trauma? Who's the patient?" Her eyes widened. 7 minutes. "Understood. Trauma Bay 1 is being cleared now." She slammed down the receiver. Instantly, the entire department was on alert. "Alistair," she shouted. The resident nearly spilled his coffee. "What happened?" "We've got a VIP incoming. Joint tactical operation near the shipyards. An explosive device detonated. 1 critical casualty. Massive hemorrhage, possible lung collapse, multiple blast injuries." Alistair's expression tightened. "A politician? Worse." Brenda was already pulling on a trauma gown. "Federal Task Force. United States Navy SEAL." The words hit the room like a shockwave. The dispatcher said he absorbed most of the blast from a breaching charge while shielding his team. Local SWAT and federal agents are already securing the hospital. The atmosphere transformed instantly. Moments earlier, everyone had been fighting exhaustion. Now adrenaline flooded every corner of the ER. Military-grade explosive injuries were rare in civilian hospitals. Most doctors had only studied them in textbooks. The reality was far more complicated, and far more terrifying. "Jefferson." Brenda pointed directly at Hannah. "I want you against the wall." Hannah looked up. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Stay out of the way." Brenda's voice was sharp. "Don't touch anything. Don't make suggestions. Don't speak unless spoken to. Just hand us supplies if we ask." She turned toward the trauma bay. "This case is way above your pay grade." Then she pointed at Alistair. "Your lead physician." Hannah said nothing. She simply slipped on a yellow isolation gown, pulled on gloves, and moved quietly to the back of the room. The countdown began. 6 minutes. 5. 4. Then the emergency doors exploded open. The noise was overwhelming. Paramedics stormed inside, pushing a gurney at full speed. Behind them came 2 heavily armed tactical operators, their uniforms streaked with soot, dirt, and blood. The patient looked like he'd been dragged straight out of a war zone. "Lieutenant Commander David Reynolds," the lead paramedic shouted. 36 years old. Close proximity explosive blast. Tourniquet applied to the right leg, but he's still bleeding heavily. Blood pressure is 70/40 and falling. The paramedic pointed toward the patient's chest. Absent breath sounds on the left side. Possible tension pneumothorax. The team transferred him onto the trauma bed. For a moment, everyone froze. The SEAL was enormous. Even injured, he looked powerful. But the blast had devastated him. His skin was ghostly pale beneath layers of blood and grime. Burn marks covered portions of his tactical gear. The smell of explosives and scorched fabric filled the room. His breathing came in uneven, ragged gasps. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Move! Alistair snapped himself into action. On 3, the transfer was completed. Almost immediately, the cardiac monitor erupted into a rapid, piercing alarm. The numbers began falling. Fast! He's crashing! Brenda shouted. She reached for an 4-line. I can't get access. His veins are collapsing. Hypovolemic shock, someone yelled. Get a central line. Alistair grabbed a scalpel. For the first time, Hannah noticed something alarming. His hands were shaking. Badly. He stared at Reynolds' damaged chest. The swelling and trauma had distorted the normal anatomical landmarks. Seconds ticked by. I can't find the insertion point, he muttered. What? I can't find it. A tactical operator stepped forward. His voice thundered through the room. Doctor, decompress his chest now. He's suffocating. I'm trying. Sweat streamed down Alistair's forehead. Brenda, control the bleeding in his leg. As she moved, the blood-soaked tourniquet shifted. A fresh surge of blood appeared. Panicking, Brenda grabbed a clamp and thrust it blindly into the wound. The reaction was immediate. Reynolds let out a deep, agonized groan. His entire body jerked violently. Hold him still, Brenda screamed. The monitor alarms intensified. The room edged closer to disaster. Then Brenda pointed toward the back wall. Jefferson. Every eye turned toward Hannah. Get over here and hold his leg down. And for the first time that night, Hannah stepped forward.
From the corner of the trauma bay, Hannah watched everything unfold. Years of experience allowed her to process the scene in seconds. She saw Dr. Alistair holding the scalpel at the wrong angle, his uncertainty growing with every passing heartbeat. The swelling across the patient's chest had distorted the normal landmarks, and hesitation was turning into danger. She saw Brenda digging blindly into the shattered tissue of the SEAL's thigh, searching for a bleeding vessel without a clear target. Every movement wasted precious time. The cardiac monitor screamed its warning. The patient's blood pressure continued to fall. His heart was running out of chances. For a brief moment, Hannah stood perfectly still. Then the civilian mask she had worn for years finally slipped away. She didn't move toward the leg as ordered. Instead, she strode directly to the head of the bed. Move. The single word cracked through the room like a rifle shot. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned. Dr. Alistair blinked in confusion. What? Hannah's gaze never left the patient. I said move, doctor. There was no hesitation in her voice. No uncertainty. Only command. Before he could respond, she stepped forward and firmly guided him aside. The stunned resident stumbled back. Jefferson, what are you doing? He shouted. She ignored him completely. The trauma bay had vanished from her awareness. There was only the patient, only the problem, only the solution. She took the scalpel. Her hands were perfectly steady. Without pausing, she located the correct position along the injured chest wall by touch, feeling beneath the swelling for the underlying anatomy. The incision was swift and precise. A second later, she advanced the instrument through the tissue and completed the procedure with practiced efficiency. The effect was immediate. A rush of trapped air escaped. The patient's chest expanded more evenly. The monitor's frantic alarms began to settle. His oxygen saturation is climbing, the respiratory therapist shouted. Several staff members stared in disbelief. Hannah was already moving. She pivoted toward the leg wound. Brenda still stood frozen beside the bed, clutching a blood-covered instrument. Step back, Hannah said. The order was calm. Cold. Absolute. Brenda's face reddened instantly. You've lost your mind. Her voice cracked with outrage. You can't just take over a trauma case. You're finished. Do you understand? Finished. She reached toward Hannah's shoulder. The movement never connected. A powerful hand suddenly shot upward from the trauma bed. It closed around Brenda's wrist. The entire room froze. Lieutenant Commander David Reynolds' eyes were barely open. Pain and medication clouded his expression. Even so, the grip was iron. Brenda let out a startled gasp. The wounded SEAL didn't look at her. His attention remained fixed on Hannah. For several long seconds, he simply stared. He studied the way she carried herself. The calm posture, the controlled movements, the complete absence of panic. Recognition slowly appeared behind the haze of pain. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. I'd know that bedside manner anywhere. His voice was rough and barely audible. Yet every person in the room heard it. The grip on Brenda's wrist loosened. With obvious effort, Reynolds raised his blood-stained hand toward his forehead. The motion was slow, painful, deliberate. A salute. Good to see you again, Major Jefferson. Silence crashed over Trauma Bay 1. No one moved. No one spoke. The steady hiss of oxygen and the rhythmic beeping of the monitor suddenly seemed deafening. Brenda stared at Hannah. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion, then to disbelief. Major, the word emerged as little more than a whisper. Dr. Alastair looked equally stunned. Only moments earlier, he had treated Hannah like an inconvenience. Now he stared as if seeing her for the first time. The quiet nurse who spent her shifts cleaning rooms and reorganizing equipment no longer looked ordinary. The confidence, the precision, the authority, none of it matched the woman they thought they knew. Near the doorway, the two federal tactical operators exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward. His name tape read Miller. He studied Hannah carefully. The realization spread across his face. No way. The words escaped before he could stop them. Hannah Jefferson? For the first time, Hannah looked away from her patient. Only briefly. Miller shook his head in disbelief. Major Hannah Jefferson, Army Medical Command. Several staff members exchanged confused looks. The name meant nothing to them. It clearly meant something to the operators. Miller gave a short, astonished laugh. The Jefferson from Karengal. The room remained silent. One of the younger nurses frowned. What does that mean? Neither operator answered immediately. Instead, both men continued staring at Hannah. Years earlier, stories about a combat trauma officer named Major Jefferson had circulated through military medical units and special operations teams alike. Stories of impossible evacuations, field surgeries performed under fire, lives saved when everyone else believed survival was impossible. Most people assumed the stories were exaggerated. Legends always were. Yet here she stood, wearing ordinary hospital scrubs. Quiet, unassuming, practically invisible, as if none of it had ever happened. Hannah ignored the attention, ignored the shock, ignored the questions. None of it mattered. Only the patient mattered. She turned back to Reynolds and checked the drainage system. Dark blood continued collecting in the chamber. Better, but not enough. Then she looked toward the paramedic maintaining pressure on the damaged artery. Keep steady pressure there, specialist. The command came instantly. Professional. Focused. The specialist obeyed without hesitation. And for the first time since the patient had arrived, every person in the trauma bay found themselves looking to Hannah Jefferson for direction.
Jefferson, Miller said, the realization striking him like a physical blow. His eyes widened as he stared at Hannah. Major Hannah Jefferson, Army Medical Command. The Jefferson from Karengal Valley Forward Operating Base. Hannah didn't acknowledge him. Her attention remained fixed on the chest tube drainage system, watching dark venous blood collect steadily in the reservoir. Keep pressure on that femoral artery, specialist, she ordered the paramedic holding the tourniquet. His pressure is stabilizing, but he's still hypovolemic. We need O-negative blood in him immediately. Rapid infuse now. Miller straightened instantly. Yes, ma'am. There wasn't even a second of hesitation. He didn't glance toward Dr. Alistair for approval. Instead, he crossed the trauma bay, grabbed the emergency blood cooler, and tossed 2 units toward the respiratory therapist. You heard the major, he barked. Get it moving. Wait. Brenda finally snapped out of her stunned silence. Her face flushed a furious shade of red. You can't take orders from her. She's a subordinate. She assaulted a physician. Miller slowly turned toward her. His hand rested casually, but unmistakably, on the grip of his sidearm. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Every conversation stopped. Every eye shifted toward him. Ma'am, Miller said quietly, his voice colder than ice. You are currently shouting in a trauma bay while my team leader is bleeding out. He took a step forward. If you do not move against that wall and remain silent, I will personally remove you from this room for interfering with a federal operation. His gaze never wavered. Do you understand me? Brenda's mouth opened, then closed. The confidence drained from her face. Without another word, she backed against a supply cabinet, suddenly looking much smaller than she had moments before. Dr. Alistaster cleared his throat. "This is highly irregular," he said weakly. "I'm the attending resident. You should be reviewing your anatomy textbooks, doctor." The room fell silent again. For the first time since entering the trauma bay, Hannah looked directly at him. Her expression was calm, almost emotionless. "You were aiming for the third intercostal space, but your insertion angle was nearly 50 degrees off." Alistaster swallowed. "You were seconds away from driving that blade into his pericardium. If you'd made that incision, Commander Reynolds would be dead." No one spoke, because everyone knew she was right. Even Alistaster knew it. The terror and chaos of the emergency had narrowed his focus until he'd missed a fatal mistake. Hannah had identified it in less than a second. The surgical team is on the elevator. The charge nurse called from the hallway, breaking the tension. "3 is prepped and waiting. Move him." Hannah didn't ask permission. She grabbed the head of the gurney. Miller immediately took the foot. Together they pushed through the double doors at a run, the medical team following close behind. Within moments, they were gone. Only Brenda and Dr. Alistaster remained standing in the blood-slicked trauma bay, surrounded by overturned packaging, discarded gauze, and the lingering smell of adrenaline and fear. The next 2 hours passed in a blur. The adrenaline carried Hannah forward long after exhaustion should have stopped her. She bypassed the usual post-trauma routines and stood silently in the operating room gallery while the chief of trauma surgery worked below. The environment felt painfully familiar. The sharp scent of iodine, the smell of cauterized tissue, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the steady hum of surgical equipment. Years ago, those sounds had been the soundtrack of her life. A life she had spent years trying to leave behind. Below the glass, surgeons repaired the extensive damage to Commander Reynolds' chest and leg. Every movement was precise, deliberate, practiced. Hannah watched without speaking, without moving. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, pale gray sunlight began filtering through the hospital's high windows. The operation was over. Commander Reynolds was alive, stable, and resting in the surgical intensive care unit. The crisis had ended, for everyone except Hannah. As she exited the staff locker room, having changed into borrowed scrub pants after throwing away her blood-soaked pair, she found 2 armed hospital security officers waiting outside. Neither looked comfortable. "Hannah Jefferson?" the larger guard asked. She nodded. "We need you to come with us to the administrative wing immediately." Hannah wasn't surprised. A deep ache settled into her body now that the adrenaline was gone. It radiated from the old shrapnel scar near her shoulder and spread through every muscle. She already knew why she was being summoned. Brenda Higgins wasn't the type of person who accepted humiliation gracefully. Her authority had been dismantled in front of an entire emergency department. She would want revenge. "Lead the way," Hannah said. The administrative boardroom couldn't have been more different from the emergency department. Instead of blood and antiseptic, the air smelled of lemon polish and expensive coffee. The long mahogany conference table stretched through the center of the room like a courtroom bench awaiting judgment. At the head sat Dr. Harrison Campbell, chief of medicine. He looked exhausted. Beside him sat the hospital's legal counsel, a sharp-faced woman typing rapidly on a laptop. And across from them sat Brenda Higgins and Dr. Richard Alistaster. Both were waiting. Neither looked happy. The real battle, Hannah realized, was only beginning. Brenda had recovered enough to repair her appearance. Her face had been washed. Fresh lipstick hid the strain around her mouth. Seated beside the chief of medicine, she wore the carefully constructed expression of a wronged professional seeking justice. Every detail of her posture projected outrage mixed with wounded dignity. Across from her, Dr. Richard Alistaster sat rigidly in his chair, arms folded tightly across his chest. His jaw was clenched so hard that the muscles twitched beneath his skin. But neither of them captured Hannah's attention. The man seated at the far end of the conference table did. He wore an immaculate United States Navy dress uniform. Silver eagles gleamed from his shoulders. His posture was relaxed, but there was something unmistakably dangerous about the quiet confidence with which he occupied the room. Hannah recognized the type immediately. Command. She entered without hesitation. She didn't take a seat. Instead, she stopped beside the table and stood at parade rest, hands clasped lightly behind her back, shoulders square, spine perfectly straight. The Navy officer noticed. A faint spark of recognition flickered in his eyes. "Nurse Jefferson." Dr. Campbell began, rubbing his temples as if fighting a migraine. "We're here to discuss the deeply disturbing events that occurred this morning." He glanced down at the documents before him. Head Nurse Higgins has filed a formal grievance, co-signed by Dr. Alistaster, citing gross insubordination, physical assault of a physician, and practicing medicine without authorization. Alistaster immediately leaned forward. "She shoved me away from a critical patient," he said loudly. "She interfered with treatment and endangered a life because she wanted to play hero." Brenda nodded sharply. "She's a menace." Her voice dripped with venom. "I've documented months of insubordinate behavior. She constantly operates outside her assigned role. She's disruptive, reckless, and a danger to Mercy General." She folded her hands on the table. "I want her employment terminated immediately and the incident reported to the State Nursing Board." Silence followed. Dr. Campbell exhaled slowly. "Hannah," he said, "you physically removed a physician from a procedure and then performed an emergency thoracostomy. Regardless of the outcome, that's well outside the legal scope of a registered nurse." He looked directly at her. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Hannah's expression never changed. She looked first at Campbell, then at Brenda, then finally at Alistaster. Her voice remained calm. The patient was suffering a tension pneumothorax. She spoke as though delivering a clinical report. Dr. Alistaster was unable to identify the correct anatomical landmarks due to extensive blast trauma swelling. His insertion trajectory would have penetrated the pericardial region. Alistaster's face reddened instantly. "The patient had less than 60 seconds before cardiovascular collapse," Hannah continued. "I intervened to preserve life. You are not qualified to make that assessment." Alistaster nearly shouted the words. He pushed himself halfway out of his chair. "You're a nurse." The room vibrated with the force of his anger. "That is enough, doctor." The voice cut through the room like a blade. Every head turned. The Navy captain had risen to his feet. His tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Authority radiated from him so naturally that the interruption instantly silenced everyone. He picked up a thick manila folder resting beside him. Unlike the hospital files stacked around the room, this one was secured with red classification tape. "Dr. Campbell," he said evenly, "my name is Captain Thomas Hayes, United States Naval Special Warfare Command." The room grew noticeably quieter. "I am the commanding officer of Lieutenant Commander Reynolds." Hayes walked slowly around the table. His polished shoes echoed softly against the floor. He stopped directly behind Hannah. "This morning," he continued, "I received a very interesting call from my tactical team." His eyes settled on Alistaster. "They informed me that an emergency room resident nearly killed one of my most decorated operators due to panic and poor judgment." Alistaster visibly stiffened. "They also informed me that his life was saved by someone they referred to as a ghost." Brenda gave a dismissive laugh. "She's no ghost. She's a liability." Hayes didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he dropped the classified folder onto the conference table. The heavy thud echoed through the room. "When Hannah Jefferson applied to this hospital," he said, opening the folder, "she submitted a civilian resume." He withdrew a document and slid it toward Dr. Campbell. What she did not provide, because much of it remained classified until 18 months ago, was her complete military service record. Campbell's eyes moved across the page, then widened. The hospital attorney stopped typing. For the first time since Hannah entered the room, she looked genuinely surprised. "Major Hannah Jefferson did not spend the last decade working in community clinics," Hayes continued. His voice seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "She served as an advanced practice trauma nurse attached to Joint Special Operations Command." No one moved. "She completed 4 combat deployments." Another page landed on the table. "She served as Chief Triage Officer for a Tier 1 surgical support unit." A third document followed. She also co-authored portions of the Department of Defense's field protocols on blast trauma resuscitation. The silence became absolute. Hayes looked directly at Alistaster. "Major Jefferson has performed more emergency thoracostomies under enemy fire than you will likely witness in your entire civilian career." Alistaster looked sick. "She holds a Bronze Star with valor." Hayes' voice hardened. "When my operators are bleeding to death in the dirt, Major Jefferson is exactly who they pray arrives first." Brenda's confidence evaporated. The realization struck her all at once. For months she had treated Hannah like an insignificant subordinate. Now she understood she had been attempting to bully someone who had spent years surviving battlefields. Captain Hayes slowly turned. Then he pointed directly at Dr. Alistaster. "You," he said. Alistaster froze. "You lack the nerve and the skill to save my man." Captain Hayes' voice wasn't loud, but it hit the room with the force of a hammer. He pointed directly at Dr. Alistaster. "My tactical team watched you freeze while Lieutenant Commander Reynolds bled out on that table." Alistaster's face drained of color. Hayes shifted his gaze toward Brenda. "And you allowed your personal ego to interfere with a life-saving intervention." Brenda opened her mouth. No words came out. "My team reported that you attempted to physically stop Major Jefferson while she was controlling a fatal hemorrhage. Had she listened to either of you, Commander Reynolds would be dead." Silence settled over the boardroom. Dr. Campbell slowly removed his glasses. For the first time that morning, the exhaustion vanished from his expression. What replaced it was something far more dangerous. Anger. Cold. Controlled. And absolute. He folded his glasses carefully on the table. "Dr. Alistaster." The resident straightened immediately. Campbell's voice was almost gentle. "As of this moment, your residency at Mercy General is suspended pending a full review by the medical board regarding your actions in Trauma Bay 1. Alistaster blinked. "What? You will clear your locker and leave hospital property immediately." The resident shot to his feet. His hands trembled. "Dr. Campbell, you can't do this." "I can. My father sits on the hospital board." Campbell's eyes hardened. "Your father cannot protect you from a malpractice investigation involving a federal military operator." The words landed like gunfire. "Get out." Alistaster looked around the room desperately. No one came to his defense. Not the lawyer. Not Brenda. Not even Hannah. Realizing he had lost, he grabbed his belongings and hurried toward the door. A second later, he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him. The room became very quiet. Then Campbell turned his attention to Brenda. For the first time in years, head nurse Brenda Higgins looked genuinely afraid. Her shoulders had collapsed. The confidence she had carried into the room was gone. "Brenda." Campbell's voice carried none of its previous warmth. "I have received complaints regarding your behavior for years." Brenda lowered her eyes. "I overlooked them because the department remained functional." He paused. "That was a mistake." Brenda swallowed hard. "Doctor, no." His interruption was immediate. "You fostered a culture of intimidation, fear, and favoritism." Every word struck harder than the last. "You bullied staff members. You undermined younger nurses. And today, you deliberately interfered with patient care because your authority was challenged." Brenda's eyes filled with tears. "Please, your employment with Mercy General is terminated effective immediately." The words hung in the air. Brenda stared at him, unable to speak. "I will also be forwarding the incident report to the State Board of Nursing for review." A small sob escaped her lips. The woman who had spent years controlling everyone around her suddenly looked very small, very fragile. Her eyes drifted toward Hannah. "Hannah, please." It was the first time she had ever used her first name. The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. Everyone in the room looked toward Hannah. Waiting. Hannah met Brenda's gaze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she spoke. Her voice remained calm, professional, unmoved. "The Environmental Services team still needs someone to clean Trauma Bay 1. Brenda blinked. "The floor is covered in blood." Hannah tilted her head slightly. "You should probably get started." A stunned silence followed. Then 2 security officers entered the room. Without resistance, Brenda stood. Her career, her authority, her carefully maintained image. Gone. As the officers escorted her toward the door, tears rolled down her cheeks. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The entire room seemed to exhale. Dr. Campbell finally looked at Hannah. "Major Jefferson." She raised an eyebrow. "Or Nurse Jefferson." A faint smile touched his lips. "I owe you an apology." He leaned forward. "The administration failed you." His gaze shifted briefly toward the empty chair Brenda had occupied. "We failed this hospital by allowing that culture to exist." Hannah considered his words. Then she nodded. "The culture is broken, Doctor." Campbell listened carefully. "Good nurses are leaving because they're treated as servants by arrogant residents and targets by insecure managers." Her voice remained steady. "Eventually that costs patients." The chief nodded slowly. "I agree." He folded his hands. "Which is why I'd like to offer you Brenda's position." The room grew quiet again. "Head nurse of emergency services." Hannah blinked. "You have the experience." Campbell smiled. "You clearly have the skill." He glanced toward Captain Hayes. And you've already earned the respect of everyone who matters. Hannah looked down at the polished table. For years she had wanted anonymity. A quiet life. No responsibility beyond her shift. No command. No battlefield. No leadership. But she thought about the frightened young nurses Brenda had humiliated. The patients who suffered because of pride. The emergency department that still, despite everything, felt like home. Maybe she couldn't fix every broken system, but she could fix this one. Slowly, Hannah smiled. A small smile. A determined one. I'll take the job. Campbell grinned. But, Hannah continued, things are going to change. The smile disappeared. No bullying. She looked around the room. No ego. Then she nodded toward the emergency department beyond the walls. We do the work, or we leave. Captain Hayes stepped forward and extended his hand. Hannah shook it. His grip was firm and respectful. Commander Reynolds asked me to pass along a message. Hannah sighed. Should I be worried? A rare smile crossed Hayes' face. He said your bedside manner is still terrible. For the first time all morning, Hannah laughed. A real laugh. The tension finally broke. And, Hayes added, he says he owes you a beer. The ghost of the battlefield had finally found her way home. And Mercy General would never be the same again.